Worship is one of the oldest behaviors in human history. It has outlived empires, languages, and even the gods themselves. Civilizations have risen and fallen, but the act of kneeling, of surrendering one's mind and heart to something unseen, has remained constant. The question is not whether people worship, but why they feel they must. Humans began to worship long before the first scriptures were written. Before temples and priests, there was thunder, fire, and the vast sky. Our ancestors looked at nature with both awe and terror, trying to understand what they couldn't control. When lightning struck a tree, it felt personal. When drought killed the crops, it felt like punishment. In that space between ignorance and fear, the idea of gods was born. Worship began as a transaction. Give something, receive protection. Sacrifice a goat, get rain. Bow your head, avoid the curse. It was a survival strategy masquerading as devotion. But even as knowledge expanded, the instinct to worship never left. The ancient fear evolved, not disappeared. Instead of storms, we began to worship order. Instead of volcanoes, we worshipped authority. Instead of spirits, we worshipped the idea of perfection itself, something greater than us, something to kneel before. The human mind is deeply uncomfortable with uncertainty. It craves hierarchy, because hierarchy feels safe. To worship is to outsource responsibility, to say, someone higher knows what I don't. It's a psychological shortcut that offers relief, but relief and truth are not the same thing. When you surrender your judgment to something else, you trade the freedom to think for the comfort of obedience. Every system of worship, no matter how different, shares one hidden core: dependence. The worshiper is always lesser, always in need, always unworthy. The divine figure, whether it's a god, a leader, or an ideology, is always elevated beyond question. That's the architecture of submission. It doesn't require evidence. It only requires repetition. You kneel enough times, and the posture becomes permanent. In psychological terms, worship operates like reinforcement. The mind repeats rituals because they bring emotional reward: peace, belonging, hope. Those are powerful incentives. It's why even intelligent people defend absurd beliefs with passion. They're not protecting an idea, they're protecting a feeling. To stop worshiping would mean confronting the emptiness that belief once filled, and most people would rather kneel in illusion than stand in uncertainty. From a social perspective, worship is less about gods and more about control. In early societies, religion provided stability, but also a hierarchy that benefited those at the top. The priests became translators between the invisible and the real, interpreters of divine will. And once humans accepted that someone else could speak for the gods, they also accepted that someone else could speak for them. The first step towards servitude was spiritual. Look at history's most powerful institutions: temples, churches, empires. They all thrive on the same equation: your obedience in exchange for their promise. But that promise has always been written on sand. No one ever met the deity. They only met the intermediaries. The worshiper prays upward, but the benefits flow downward to the ones collecting offerings, shaping doctrines, and defining what sacred means. Yet, worship isn't limited to religion. In modern life, it has merely changed its costume. People worship money, fame, nations, ideologies, even influencers. They don't call it worship, but the psychology is identical. There's devotion, ritual, blind defense, and emotional surrender. The altar just looks different now. It glows from a screen instead of stone. When a person treats something as beyond question, they have already begun to worship it. The urge to worship may not be moral or divine. It may be biological. Neuroscientists have found that religious or devotional experiences activate the same brain regions involved in attachment, emotion, and reward. The sensation of feeling God's presence mirrors the neural activity of a child feeling a parent's protection. In other words, worship might be an emotional regression, the mind's return to the safety of dependency. When life feels vast and uncontrollable, the human brain reaches for something larger than itself, not out of logic, but comfort. The tragedy is that worship often disguises itself as humility, but genuine humility doesn't require submission. It requires perspective. Humility says, I am small, but I can learn. Worship says, I am small, so I must obey. One leads to growth, the other to stagnation. The more we kneel, the less we see. Across time, worship has justified everything from compassion to cruelty. It has inspired art, music, and architecture, but also wars, inquisitions, and the erasure of entire cultures. Every blade has two edges. When belief is placed above evidence, when devotion is valued more than reason, the cost is always human. The paradox is that worship feels noble while quietly eroding self-respect. It teaches people to measure their worth by their loyalty to something they can't question. To doubt becomes sin, to think becomes rebellion. And so, generations pass down the same rituals without asking why they began. That's not faith, it's inertia. But the human story also has another thread. Those who refuse to bow, philosophers, scientists, reformers, individuals who dared to challenge what others accepted as untouchable. They broke altars, not out of hatred, but hunger for truth. They saw that reverence for falsehood, no matter how sacred it feels, keeps humanity small. Every step forward in knowledge has come from someone willing to stand instead of kneel. And yet, even rebellion can become worship. The moment an idea becomes, as sacred, immune to scrutiny, it inherits the same flaw as religion. Whether it's political ideology or scientific dogma, the danger is the same: unthinking devotion. Worship always begins with admiration, but it ends with blindness. The question then becomes, can humans exist without worshiping anything at all? Or is worship simply the shadow of our fear, destined to reappear in new forms every time we think we've escaped it? The instinct to worship didn't begin with religion. It began with survival. Early humans lived in a world where everything seemed intentional. A rustle in the dark could mean danger. A flash of lightning could mean anger. The brain, wired to detect patterns, saw intention everywhere. This hyper-awareness helped our ancestors stay alive, but it also gave birth to superstition. When survival depends on prediction, it's safer to imagine that something out there controls everything. Worship was not born out of wisdom. It was born out of fear's imagination. Anthropologists call this agency detection, the mind's tendency to assume that every event has a conscious cause. It's the same instinct that makes a child think the wind wants to blow their kite away. In a prehistoric mind, agency detection was a shield against chaos. Better to imagine a spirit in the forest than to accept randomness. But when that instinct became collective, it evolved into organized belief. A myth repeated by many becomes a truth defended by millions. And so, worship began as a tool of coordination. It created shared stories that bound tribes together. Belief in a common protector gave strangers a reason to trust one another. Religion was the world's first social glue, and worship, its emotional currency. But what began as a strategy for unity gradually transformed into a mechanism for control. Every belief system, once established, learns how to protect itself. It builds taboos, hierarchies, and doctrines to preserve its authority. The act of worship becomes less about gratitude and more about obedience. Questioning it threatens the structure itself. That's why ancient rulers were often gods or chosen by them, not because they were divine, but because divinity makes power unquestionable. The pharaohs, emperors, and kings all understood that worship shapes minds more efficiently than violence. You can't rule millions by the sword alone, but if people believe your rule is sacred, they'll police themselves. They'll fear their own thoughts. That's the genius of worship. It replaces chains with devotion. Even today, this pattern persists. Governments, corporations, and movements all exploit the same human impulse. Replace God with brand, leader, or nation, and the mechanism remains identical. People still gather, chant, donate, and defend without question. The faces change, the psychology doesn't. When humans worship, they surrender agency. And whoever receives that surrender inherits power. To worship is to misplace one's curiosity. It redirects the question, why, into, how high should I bow? The search for meaning turns into the ritual of submission. And once that happens, truth becomes secondary. Belief no longer depends on reality. Reality is forced to fit belief. That inversion, when faith defines truth instead of the other way around, is how civilizations build illusions that last millennia. The tragedy is that worship can make intelligent people defend absurdities, It hijacks the emotional core of the mind, love, fear, belonging, and uses it to reinforce authority. That's why, when faced with contradictory evidence, true believers double down instead of doubting. The discomfort of being wrong feels like betrayal. Worship transforms being mistaken into being sinful. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance, the tension between belief and reality. When reality threatens a cherished idea, the brain chooses comfort over correction. It's not rational, but it's deeply human. Worship thrives on that mechanism, feeding on our emotional need for certainty in a chaotic world. But what happens when certainty is no longer comforting? What happens when the sacred begins to feel hollow? Throughout history, people have experienced moments when worship collapses, when prayers go unanswered, when promises fail, when the illusion cracks. These moments often lead to one of two paths: despair or awakening. Despair leads back to obedience. I must have done something wrong. Awakening leads to awareness. Perhaps there was never anyone listening. The first path restores the system. The second threatens it. Think of Galileo, forced to recant his discoveries because they contradicted religious doctrine. His telescope revealed moons orbiting Jupiter, proof that Earth was not the center of everything. But the church demanded worship, not observation. Truth was irrelevant if it challenged authority. To protect the illusion of divine order, they silenced the very man expanding humanity's understanding of the cosmos. That's the power of worship. It can make people defend their own ignorance in the name of holiness. Even in modern times, worship still shapes the boundaries of what can be questioned. It hides under politeness, respect for belief. But what it really means is, do not touch the untouchable. Yet every idea that cannot be touched eventually decays. When reverence replaces inquiry, progress halts. To understand why worship feels so appealing, we have to examine its emotional core. Beneath devotion lies fear of isolation. Worship offers community, the sense of being part of something infinite. That's intoxicating. When life feels insignificant, worship promises significance. When existence feels random, worship offers destiny. When we feel alone, it whispers, "You are watched, you are loved." It's a comforting fiction that speaks to the deepest human anxieties, the desire to matter, to be known, to be safe. But that comfort comes at a price. The promise of unconditional love from an invisible being also demands unconditional submission. And unconditional submission is indistinguishable from servitude. The love of a deity is the perfect carrot, infinite, unprovable, and dependent on obedience. It ensures loyalty without negotiation. There's also a darker side to worship that often goes unnoticed: moral outsourcing. When people believe their values come from a higher power, they stop taking responsibility for them. They justify cruelty as righteousness, violence as faith, exclusion as purity. The worst acts in history were not committed by monsters who thought they were evil, but by believers convinced they were serving something holy. Worship grants moral immunity to those who act in its name. Take the medieval Crusades. Armies slaughtered thousands believing they were doing divine work. Or modern extremists who kill in the name of purity, convinced they're earning paradise. Worship transforms murder into duty. It replaces conscience with command. Even beyond violence, moral outsourcing corrupts daily life. When people say God will judge, they often mean, I don't have to. It's a convenient abdication of responsibility. If morality depends on worship, then goodness becomes obedience, not empathy. And when obedience defines morality, tyranny becomes inevitable. The most unsettling question is whether humans are capable of living morally without worship. Many assume morality requires a divine source, that without belief, chaos would reign. But history shows the opposite. Morality predates religion, cooperation, fairness, empathy. These are evolutionary traits found in social species long before any god was imagined. A wolf protects its pack. An ape shares food. A human comforts another. These instincts are not divine gifts. They are survival strategies. Religion merely codified them and claimed ownership. Philosophers like Spinoza and Epicurus understood this centuries ago. They argued that good behavior arises from reason and empathy, not divine reward or punishment. To act kindly because it's right, not because it's commanded, that's the essence of genuine ethics. Worship corrupts that by turning morality into transaction. Be good so you'll be rewarded. But true goodness doesn't negotiate. Even art and culture, though often intertwined with worship, flourish most when liberated from it. The Renaissance didn't bloom because of faith, but because reason began to eclipse it. When human creativity stopped fearing divine boundaries, it redefined beauty, science, and freedom. The same impulse that once built cathedrals began building telescopes. Still, worship persists, not because it's rational, but because it's emotional. It's not about truth, it's about comfort. It fills the silence that reality leaves. It gives shape to uncertainty. And yet, every step humanity takes toward understanding the universe reduces the space where worship hides. The stars no longer need gods to shine. The thunder no longer speaks divine anger. The rainbow is not a promise, it's refraction. But knowledge alone doesn't erase the longing to kneel. Even in an age of science, humans still crave meaning. The question is whether that meaning requires worship, or whether it can be built from within. Worship thrives on vertical relationships, a superior above, a servant below, but meaning can grow horizontally, between people, through understanding, compassion, and shared purpose. The vertical model enslaves, the horizontal one empowers. It says, no one above, no one below, only minds meeting as equals, facing the unknown together. And yet, the remnants of the old instinct remain strong. It's in the language we use: praise, thank heavens, pray for strength. Even those who no longer believe often mimic the forms of worship unconsciously. The posture outlasts the belief. It shows how deep the habit runs. To truly move beyond worship, one must not only reject the gods, but the psychological need for masters of any kind. Freedom is not merely the absence of a deity. It's the courage to think without one. Worship thrives because it serves a deep and often unspoken need, the need for certainty. Certainty is what people crave most in an unpredictable world. It offers comfort, it promises security, and it provides an answer to the constant question, what's the point of all this? But the problem with certainty is that it often comes at the expense of truth. When we cling to beliefs that offer simple answers, we stop asking complex questions. Worship is one of the oldest and most persistent forms of this trade-off, the trade between comfort and reality. When worship is at its most effective, it transcends the realm of religion and bleeds into every corner of life. It becomes not just about the gods we pray to, but the ideologies, the leaders, the systems of belief that we serve without question. Whether it's nationalism, political ideology, or even celebrity culture, worship is the act of placing something above critical scrutiny, and in doing so, surrendering our own capacity for independent thought. Think of the intense loyalty people feel toward their countries, not just as a geographical space, but as a symbol of something greater. The flag, the anthem, the rituals, all of these elements elevate the nation to a sacred level. The worship of nationhood isn't as overt as religious rituals, but it is no less real. People will fight, die, and kill for a country in a way that goes beyond logic or reason. It's an emotional and psychological investment that can only be explained by the deeply ingrained desire to worship something larger than oneself. This instinct doesn't stop with nations. It extends to figures who embody certain ideals: politicians, celebrities, even philosophers. These individuals are often elevated to the status of near gods, their words unchallenged, their actions above reproach. The act of worship shifts from the divine to the secular, but the pattern remains unchanged. We elevate these figures because they represent certainty, order, and meaning. We put them on pedestals because, like the gods of old, they give us a sense of direction. They tell us who we are, where we belong, and what our lives are supposed to mean. This kind of worship doesn't require physical altars or incense. It operates quietly within our minds and our hearts. It manifests in the way we talk about certain people or ideas with reverence, in the way we defend them against all criticism, in the way we adapt our lives around them. And yet, this kind of worship often remains unquestioned, as if it's perfectly natural. But just because something is ingrained in society doesn't mean it's right. When worship enters the realm of the secular, we often fail to see it for what it is: a mechanism for control, a tool that manipulates the way we think and act. Think of the way people speak about politicians in messianic terms. Some leaders have been described as saviors or messengers of a new era. The adoration can be overwhelming, and it goes beyond mere support for political ideas. It's a psychological investment, a devotion that sees the leader not as a fallible human being, but as a figure who embodies an idealized version of the future. The fervor with which people worship these figures often clouds their judgment, making them blind to the flaws and contradictions that are inherent in every human being. This devotion to a political figure is the same as devotion to a god. It is rooted in the desire for certainty, order, and meaning. But it isn't just political figures. In the age of technology, worship has found new avenues. Tech giants, CEOs, and innovators are revered like deities. They're celebrated not only for their accomplishments, but for the promise they represent. The promise of a better world, a more convenient future, a world free from the struggles that make life so difficult. People believe in these figures because they offer hope, they offer solutions, and they offer an idealized vision of what the future could look like. But just like any other form of worship, this is a dangerous game. When we place our faith in people, in ideas, or in systems that we do not fully understand, we risk losing sight of reality. In the past, we worshiped the unknown, the gods of the storm, the sun, the sea. But today, we worship the unknown in the form of technology, and the dangers are the same. Just as the ancient world's worship of gods led to the suppression of knowledge, today's worship of technology and progress often obscures the need for critical thinking and ethical reflection. It becomes too easy to justify the exploitation of workers or the destruction of the environment when we believe that technology and progress will eventually fix everything. This kind of worship has an insidious way of creeping into our lives. It doesn't demand that we bow our heads or light candles. Instead, it demands our attention, our time, and our loyalty. It controls how we live, how we interact with others, and how we view the world. Just as religious worship once sought to control the body through rituals and commands, modern secular worship controls the mind by offering us a constant stream of distractions, ideals, and promises that may never materialize. But there's a deeper question here, one that gets at the heart of the human experience. Why do we need to worship at all? What is it about the human condition that drives us to place something above ourselves? To answer this, we need to understand the fear that drives worship. The fear of the unknown, the fear of suffering, the fear of death. Worship is ultimately a defense mechanism. It offers us protection from the harshness of reality. It provides a comforting illusion that someone, or something, is in control. It promises us meaning, even when the world feels meaningless. But in offering us this false sense of security, worship also robs us of something crucial: our autonomy. Worship takes away the power to think critically, to question, to explore the vast complexities of existence. Instead of embracing the unknown, we allow ourselves to be seduced by the illusion of certainty. When we worship, we stop seeking our own answers. We stop searching for the truth that lies beneath the surface. We accept what we're told, whether it's in the form of sacred texts or political manifestos. We stop questioning the world around us, and in doing so, we stop learning. The act of worship is an emotional and psychological surrender. It's a way of avoiding the discomfort of ambiguity, the unease of uncertainty. But the truth is that life is inherently uncertain. We don't have all the answers, and that's okay. The search for meaning, the pursuit of knowledge, the willingness to accept that we don't know everything. These are the things that allow us to grow and evolve. Worship, on the other hand, traps us in a state of stagnation. It offers us the illusion of meaning, but it does so at the cost of our intellectual freedom. So, why worship? The answer is simple. We worship because it gives us a sense of control in a chaotic world. It provides us with a sense of belonging, a way to connect with others, and a way to avoid confronting the harsh realities of existence. But it also keeps us from the most important thing of all, the freedom to think, to question, and to find our own way in the world. At the heart of worship is a powerful desire for certainty. Humans want to know that there is a plan, that life is not just a series of random events, that there's meaning behind the chaos. Worship gives people that sense of certainty. It wraps the unknown in a neat, comforting package. But what happens when that certainty is questioned, or when it breaks down completely? One of the most striking things about worship is its ability to endure even in the face of contradiction. As modern knowledge continues to expand, and as science pushes the boundaries of what we know about the universe, worship of gods and ideologies should, in theory, lose its grip on our collective psyche. Yet, it doesn't. In fact, it often becomes more entrenched. The reason for this is simple. The need for certainty doesn't diminish with knowledge. In many ways, it grows stronger. This is evident in the way that worship adapts to new forms. It's not that belief in gods has disappeared, but that it has been replaced or transformed by new objects of reverence. Political ideologies, celebrities, technologies, and movements all now claim the same devotion that was once reserved for deities. The structures may change, but the need to surrender to something greater than oneself remains the same. Take the rise of celebrity worship. In the past, people may have worshipped gods or saints, figures who were believed to be divinely inspired or connected to something transcendent. Today, many people elevate celebrities to the same status, despite knowing full well that these individuals are fallible humans, driven by fame, money, and ego. The obsession with celebrities reflects the human need for certainty, but it does so through the lens of modern culture. Celebrities offer something that religion once did: a sense of belonging, a symbol of success, a pathway to feeling special and significant. It's not just the celebrities themselves, but the entire system around them. From the media that elevates them to the industries that profit from their image, the worship of celebrities is now a multi-billion-dollar industry. People consume their images, their personalities, their lifestyles, and they do it with the same fervor once reserved for saints. It's a modern form of worship that serves the same psychological needs: the desire to be part of something larger, to feel as though we are connected to something greater than ourselves. Celebrities, like gods, represent the unattainable, the idealized version of beauty, success, or happiness. This shift from gods to celebrities isn't just a harmless cultural phenomenon. It's a reflection of something deeper within us. Worship is a way to cope with the enormity of existence. It's a way to find meaning in a world that often seems indifferent. The reason we worship celebrities is the same reason we once worshipped gods. We want to belong to something that promises us significance. We want to believe that our lives matter, that we are part of a larger narrative, even if that narrative is based on fame and superficial ideals. But what happens when the illusion of worship fades? What happens when the veil is lifted, and we see that our idols are not the paragons of perfection we believe them to be? History is full of figures who were once worshipped, only to have their flaws and corruption revealed. The ancient gods, too, were often depicted as deeply flawed beings, jealous, vengeful, and petty. Yet, people worshipped them because the gods represented the certainty they needed. Even when those gods didn't behave in the way we might expect a higher being to act, they still offered something essential: a sense of order, a sense of power, a sense of structure in a world that otherwise made no sense. But these figures, whether divine or human, are never perfect. And as we come to see their imperfections, we are faced with a difficult truth. The objects of worship are only as strong as the illusions we create around them. As soon as those illusions crack, worship begins to lose its power. People either turn to another idol, or they are forced to confront the uncomfortable possibility that the answers they sought from worship may have been false all along. And here's the crucial point. Worship has always been a crutch, a psychological mechanism that allows us to avoid the discomfort of doubt and uncertainty. It offers us answers when we fear the unknown, but in doing so, it prevents us from asking the most important questions. The question, why worship, often goes unanswered because it doesn't want to be answered. Worship asks us to surrender our autonomy, to stop questioning, to stop searching for the uncomfortable truth. It asks us to accept things on faith alone, even when evidence may suggest otherwise. What if the need to worship is not a natural part of being human? What if it's a learned behavior, passed down through generations as a way of coping with the existential questions that we have no answers to? Worship might be a product of our fear of mortality, our dread of meaninglessness. It offers us an escape, but it also locks us into a system where thinking for ourselves is secondary to following the crowd. Yet, this is where it gets complicated. The act of worship, the devotion, the rituals, the sense of belonging, can be incredibly fulfilling. It fills a void that is hard to ignore, especially in a world that often feels fragmented and disconnected. But the very act of worship comes with a catch. It requires us to stop thinking critically. It requires us to accept, without question, that someone or something else holds the key to our understanding. It requires surrender. For those who are no longer able to believe in traditional forms of worship, the question becomes, what now? If we reject the gods, the idols, the leaders, what do we replace them with? Can we live without worshiping anything? Can we find meaning, significance, and connection without the crutch of an external power to lean on? The answer, however, might be far simpler than we think. Freedom lies in the absence of worship, the liberation from the need to place. Something above ourselves is the first step toward true autonomy. If we are not beholden to a god, a leader, or an ideology, then we are free to think, to question, and to create meaning from within. We no longer need to look outside of ourselves for answers. We can look inward. We can embrace the uncertainty that comes with being human without the need for certainty provided by worship. This freedom isn't about rejecting all forms of belief or meaning. It's about finding meaning without needing to worship. It's about creating our own path without relying on the validation of an unseen force or a charismatic leader. We can find connection with others through mutual respect, empathy, and understanding, not through blind devotion to an idea or figurehead. We can seek truth through exploration and inquiry, not through submission. Worship, in the end, offers a temporary solution to a permanent problem, the fear of not knowing. But that fear is also the gateway to growth. It's in the not knowing that we learn, that we evolve, that we build understanding. The act of worship may offer comfort, but it also keeps us from embracing the full potential of our own minds. Worship has been a part of humanity for so long that it feels almost instinctual, a deep-seated part of our psyche. But the more we look at it from a critical standpoint, the more it reveals itself as a construct, a psychological, emotional, and social mechanism designed to satisfy our deepest fears and uncertainties. When we worship, we seek to answer the unanswerable, to impose meaning on a world that may not offer any. But can we truly find meaning by surrendering ourselves to an external force? Or is the act of worship simply a way to avoid confronting the deeper, uncomfortable truths about existence? When we look at human history, we see that worship has served as a means of consolidating power, control, and authority. The priests of ancient Egypt, the emperors of Rome, the kings of medieval Europe, they all understood the power of worship. They recognized that when people worship, they are not just expressing devotion. They are giving up something critical, their autonomy. Worship strips away the individual's ability to question, to challenge, to think for themselves. It asks the worshiper to accept, without hesitation, that they are smaller than something greater, and that their place in the world is to obey, not to question. In the past, religious leaders held an almost godlike power over people's lives. The Vatican, for instance, was not just a religious institution, it was a political empire, a center of influence that dictated the moral, cultural, and social direction of much of Europe. The power of religion extended far beyond the spiritual realm. It governed everything from what people ate to whom they could marry. By maintaining control over the worshippers, these institutions maintained control over society itself. Today, the faces may have changed, but the underlying structure remains the same. Worship is still a tool for maintaining control. Instead of religious figures, we have political figures, business leaders, and cultural icons. And while they may not be wearing crowns or holding staffs, the power they wield is no less significant. They become the objects of devotion, the centers around which people's lives revolve. And just as worshippers once bowed before gods to seek protection or favor, people today bow before celebrities, political leaders, and corporations in exchange for status, security, and a sense of belonging. But this kind of devotion, regardless of who or what is being worshipped, has a darker side. It's not just about submission. It's about relinquishing critical thought. Worship often comes with a set of beliefs that are beyond challenge, beyond question. When we worship something, we cease to see it as it is, and instead view it through a lens of reverence and unquestioning loyalty. This happens not only in religious worship, but also in the devotion to ideologies and political figures. The danger is clear. When people elevate something or someone to a sacred level, they stop questioning its actions, its motives, and its consequences. Think of the political movements throughout history that have been built on blind devotion, movements that promise salvation, paradise or a utopian future, but ended in devastation. From the rise of fascism in Europe to the authoritarian regimes that have taken root in many parts of the world, worship of the leader and the ideology has often led to mass suffering. The cult of personality is one of the most dangerous forms of worship because it encourages individuals to suspend their own moral judgment in favor of a singular vision, one that is often far from the truth. The worship of political leaders doesn't just remove the capacity to question, it transforms politics into something religious. Politics becomes a form of worship, with every speech and every policy viewed as divinely inspired. The people involved in these movements are not just followers, they are devotees. They give up their autonomy, their ability to think for themselves, in exchange for a sense of belonging and purpose. This is what makes political ideologies so potent. They fill the gap left by religion, offering a similar promise of meaning and security, but in a secular form. What happens when the leader falters, when the promises are broken, when the vision turns out to be a lie? Worship, once it is entrenched, doesn't simply end. The fervor and loyalty continue, often long after the leader's reign has ended. People continue to worship the ideal they believe in, rather than face the uncomfortable truth that the system they supported was flawed from the start. The same pattern plays out in the world of business. Corporate worship is perhaps one of the most insidious forms of modern worship. Think of the way people treat certain CEOs or tech companies like modern-day gods. There's an almost religious fervor to the admiration and support for figures like Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, or the giants behind Google and Facebook. These individuals are seen as almost infallible. Their ideas and innovations are celebrated as if they are divine revelations, their actions justified no matter the consequences. The loyalty to these figures is not based on their intrinsic qualities as individuals, but on what they represent. They symbolize progress, innovation, and the future. Their products have become so integrated into everyday life that to criticize them feels like sacrilege. This is worship, but without the altars or incense. It's a new form of devotion, one that's just as dangerous because it removes our ability to critique, to analyze, and to push back against systems that may be exploitative, harmful, or unjust. But worship in the secular world doesn't stop with individuals. It extends to entire systems, to capitalism, to democracy, to technology. There are whole movements built around defending these systems without question, elevating them to an almost sacred status. Capitalism is often treated as an unquestionable force of nature, something that just works because it is the way things are. And democracy is often revered in a similar light. Despite its many flaws, despite its inequities, it is defended as the ultimate form of governance beyond reproach. The worship of these systems robs us of our ability to imagine alternatives, to envision a different world. Worship stops critical thinking in its tracks. It transforms systems into sacred cows, untouchable, unquestionable, and above scrutiny. And when systems like capitalism or democracy begin to fail, as they often do, the response isn't to re-examine them, but to double down on them. We don't ask, what's wrong with this system? We ask, how can we make this system work? Worship creates a barrier to real change. It freezes the status quo in place, turning systems into idols that no longer serve the people, but demand that the people serve them. The act of worship at its core asks us to ignore the contradictions, to turn a blind eye to the imperfections, and to stop questioning what is presented as the ultimate truth. It asks us to surrender, not just our bodies, but our minds, our capacity for independent thought. Worship creates comfort, but it also creates stagnation. It makes us feel safe, but it also keeps us trapped. Worship is not inherently a bad thing. It's the way it is used and the way it's applied that often becomes the problem. When we worship something, we stop thinking for ourselves. We stop questioning the world around us. We stop looking for the truth. Worship offers us comfort, but it does so at the cost of our autonomy and our freedom. The real challenge, then, is not to simply reject worship, but to recognize the ways in which it operates in our lives. Whether it's religion, politics, or technology, we must be aware of how the impulse to worship can creep into our thoughts and actions. True freedom comes from questioning everything, from rejecting the idea that there is something above us, something that we must obey or revere, True autonomy comes from the courage to think for ourselves and to accept that we may never have all the answers. In the end, worship keeps us tethered to the past, to ideas and systems that no longer serve us. To break free, we must learn to let go of the need to worship and instead embrace the complexity, the uncertainty, and the freedom that come with questioning the world around us. Worship has always promised clarity in a confusing world. It tells people what is good, what is evil, what to love, what to fear. It defines right and wrong so neatly that moral questions seem to have ready-made answers. It gives purpose where there might otherwise be uncertainty. Yet beneath that comfort lies a quiet exchange. When we accept those answers unquestioningly, we stop searching for our own. The mind that worships becomes a vessel, not an engine. When you strip away the symbols and the rituals, every form of worship rests on one core assumption, that something else knows better, that there is a higher mind, a higher truth, a higher purpose that we, in our smallness, cannot fully grasp. This assumption can sound noble, even poetic, but it carries a heavy price. Once you accept that someone else, divine or human, understands reality better than you do, you begin to see your own reasoning as secondary. That's how obedience takes root, not through chains, but through reverence. Children learn this early. They're taught to look upward, to parents, teachers, priests, leaders, and associate authority with truth. That pattern becomes deeply embedded in the psyche. As adults, we often continue to look for figures to fill that same role, someone to tell us what to believe, how to live, and what to value. It's easier than carrying the full weight of freedom. Worship, in many ways, is a continuation of childhood, a longing for someone else to hold the answers. This doesn't make people weak, it makes them human. The universe is vast, and existence can feel unbearable without structure. But the danger begins when the search for comfort replaces the search for truth. Worship doesn't just offer structure, it demands loyalty to it. It teaches people to defend their beliefs, not because they're true, but because they're theirs. It teaches identity over inquiry, belonging over honesty. Across history, this pattern repeats. The same human impulse that built cathedrals also burned heretics. The same love that inspires devotion also breeds division. Every religion, every ideology, every movement born out of worship eventually turns its gaze outward, defining who belongs and who doesn't. Once a group believes its truth is sacred, everyone outside becomes a threat. The boundaries of worship are also the beginnings of conflict. That's why the most violent chapters in history have always been written in the name of something holy. The Crusades, the Inquisition, the witch hunts, all justified through worship. Not worship of cruelty, but of certainty. The people who carried out those acts weren't monsters. They were believers. They thought they were saving souls, defending truth, serving justice. Worship doesn't turn people evil. It blinds them to the evil of their own actions. Even today, that blindness persists. You can see it in the way political factions treat their ideologies as sacred, in the way people attack each other online, not to exchange ideas, but to defend their moral gods. You can see it in corporations that cloak exploitation in the language of innovation, in nations that justify oppression as patriotism. Worship doesn't need temples anymore. It has algorithms, hashtags, and slogans. It doesn't require incense. It thrives on attention. The modern world hasn't outgrown worship. It has industrialized it. The attention economy feeds on devotion. Social media platforms are built to create worshipful behavior. Obsession, repetition, ritual. Every like is a small genuflection. Every influencer a digital deity. The same mechanisms that once filled churches now fill timelines. The goal is no longer salvation, it's validation. And validation, like faith, is addictive. But if worship is so deeply ingrained, if it's woven into our psychology and our social structures, can we ever live without it? Can humanity exist without kneeling to something? The answer may not be to eliminate worship entirely, but to transform it. Imagine directing that same energy inward, not outward. What if the act of reverence was no longer about surrender, but about awareness? Instead of worshiping gods, what if we honored truth? Instead of kneeling before ideals, what if we stood beside them? Worship says, I am lesser. Understanding says, I am learning. The difference seems small, but it changes everything. When we replace worship with curiosity, reverence becomes discovery. The devotion that once belonged to prayer can belong to study, art, compassion, and self-reflection. The awe that once turned toward the heavens can turn toward the universe itself, not as a mystery to be feared, but as a reality to be explored. This isn't arrogance, it's honesty. It's recognizing that meaning is not given, it's made. The philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre said that to be free is to carry the weight of your own existence. That's what worship often tries to relieve us from, that weight. It offers an invisible scaffold to lean on, but leaning too long makes us forget how to stand. Real freedom means learning to live without that scaffold, even when it feels unsteady. It means creating meaning where none is promised, and finding strength not in certainty, but in the courage to question. Science and philosophy, at their best, embody this spirit. They don't worship the universe. They investigate it. They don't assume purpose. They search for patterns. Every discovery humanity has ever made, every law of physics, every medical breakthrough, every work of art, came not from worship, but from wonder, from the willingness to look at what others called sacred and ask, why? That question is the antidote to worship. Yet, wonder and worship are often mistaken for the same thing. They both involve awe, both stem from humility. The difference is direction. Worship ends the search, wonder begins it. Worship kneels, wonder stands. Worship demands loyalty. Wonder invites curiosity. Worship closes the book. Wonder opens it. To reject worship doesn't mean rejecting beauty, gratitude, or reverence. It means rejecting the surrender of the mind. It means valuing the process of questioning more than the comfort of believing. It's about reclaiming the capacity to think, to doubt, to stand alone without the crutch of dogma. It's not an easy path, and freedom never is, but it's the only path that leads forward. And here's the quiet irony. When we stop worshiping, we often discover a deeper kind of meaning, not one handed down by authority, but one we create ourselves, meaning born from love, from creativity, from connection, from curiosity. These things don't require worship. They require presence. They require courage. They require us to face the world not as servants of something higher, but as participants in something vast and unfinished. Perhaps the greatest act of reverence isn't kneeling before the unknown, but standing before it, aware of our smallness, yet unafraid. To live without worship is not to live without wonder, but to live without submission. It is to look at the universe and say, I do not need to bow to understand its beauty. That is the ultimate liberation, not from gods, but from the need for them. So when someone asks, why worship? The answer might be, we don't have to. We can admire without surrender. We can love without kneeling. We can find meaning without masters. The capacity for wonder, curiosity, and compassion already lives within us. It doesn't need permission from the divine. And maybe that's what truly frightens those who depend on worship to hold power, that people might realize they were never powerless to begin with. So, wherever you are right now, listening, thinking, perhaps reflecting on your own life, I want to know something. Where are you listening from? What time is it there? And what do you think about worship? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective.